sad depressing things are reality. Tonight, we bring you the special report. First, Sebastián Sanchez will brief you on the horrible situations the workers of Packingtown go through.
Months after our first interview, we had the opportunity to talk again with Jurgis Rutkus, but this time he was in jail. You could see at the very first sight of his eyes how he was feeling. Anger, sadness, disappointment, anguish, and a mixture of painful feelings showed how the work in Packingtown had worn him out. He first told us about how the dangerous laboring conditions had taken him to lose his job. It happened once in a while that the hogs or the cattle were not dead and they stood up and ran all over the killing beds. This is much more dangerous than what it sounds, since every man started running with knives in their hands through the blinding steam. Adding to that, the bosses came out with rifles, trying to shoot down the wild beasts. It was not a surprise that in the midst of this chaos, Jurgis had twisted his ankle and had to be out for several weeks. After days of recovery, he went back to Brown's and realized he had been replaced with a man that did the work equal or better than him. The bosses didn't have any consideration on a hard, accomplished, and skillful worker as Jurgis, and their greed was not a delay to get another person that could do the same as the Lithuanian men. After that, everything went from bad to worse. He was not as strong and vigorous as he was before, and now he had a dreadful appearance that would make every boss refuse him a job. After being entire days standing in a line and talking with every boss in Packingtown, his only option was to go to the fertilizer factories. There was not a place in a decent factory for a man whose vitality had disappeared. The invisible hand would never choose a man like this to have a job. The fertilizer factory is the worst place where a desperate human being could get. Jurgis had to endure the sickness of working in a cloud of animal excrements. After a few days, he was condemned to live smelling like manure. This is a perfect example of how bad the working conditions were, and how little the bosses care about their workmen. Finally, he told us about how he ended up behind the bars. The stories of the bosses who sexually abused from their woman workers became real. His wife Ona was abused by her boss. He threatened her, saying that if she said anything, he would make sure that she and everyone else in her family would lose their job and starve to death. After talking with Jurgis, we realized once again that capitalism and greed will only benefit the bosses and owners, but never the proletariats who had to go every day and work for the wealth of their superiors. It is very evident how employers only care about what they were gaining, ignoring everything else around them, including their workers. The bosses didn't consider them as human beings, but more as replaceable objects that will work to make them wealthier.
Well, the truth is definitely very shocking. Now, we follow through with Pedro Giraldo's report on the corruption of society. Whereas it was implied and only slight traces of the corruption of society were visible before, it is now evident capitalism has changed the people of Chicago for the worse. Everything humans held dear was torn apart by greed, and all the foul things that emanated: hate, anger, jealousy, treachery, and many more. First, their cultural values were slowly pulled apart until they were gone, as can be seen in the case of Jurgis Rutkus' family, who came from Lithuania with a very latent culture, which they respected always, like when old Antanas died, whom they were forced to dispense with nearly all the decencies of a funeral, meaning they made every expense necessary for it to be a good funeral, even though they didn't necessarily afford it. However, now, when Teta Elzbieta's youngest died, Jurgis quickly dismissed the idea of a funeral because they couldn't afford it. Money became such a priority that he gave one of his culture's most important beliefs in order to save some dollars. Second, their family's code was broken. When being together as a family ceased to be the main priority. Instead, each individual in the family sought their own personal comfort. This is very visible when Jurgis begins drinking after work, spending all his hard-earned money on alcohol and returning home alone, whereas he used to wait for his wife and aunt. Before, he would save all his money for the well-being of the family, but now he spent it on his comfort and thirst for booze. The kids also began sleeping outside the house, since it was more comfortable for them, but worst of all Their cousins and mother did not care as long as they brought $1 each day. And last, Jonas left them to seek his own fortune. At first, they were a close pack, but now each went their own way. Money and personal comfort became the main priority. Third, the people of Packingtown began lashing out their inner problems with anger and violence, as is the case with Jurgis, who was initially a soft fellow, but now resorted to beating the children when they wouldn't go to work or bring enough money, and worse, would lash out in anger at his wife for her not coming home and ultimately was willing to kill a man. Any rational mind would avoid these behaviors and seek a way to endure the hardships of life. But when there is only hardships to a life driven by greed, getting angry and being mad was only a slight manifestation of the filth that came from capital. And it didn't only happen within the families. The whole system of the United States, based on the human rights and constitution, was ripped into sunders when there was no longer a justice system that worked in justice, but rather the judge's interests and who could bribe him the most. Children could no longer be educated because they had to work. People no longer chose who to have sexual relationships with because their job was on the line. Taking all this together, we have a very simple common factor: capitalism, but most importantly, greed. It is the greed that takes out the worst in everyone and starts harming everyone out of their lives. It is a vacuum that strikes into the heart of people and brings out everything filthy inside of them. It opens Pandora's box and soaks the world in bad things, leading to the overall corruption of society.
Could this get any worse? Here is Federico Rojas, reporting for Consumers.
Hello, Pedro. Local markets have developed strategies that abuse and violate consumers and their lack of knowledge. These strategies take advantage of the unpleasant environment and absorb consumers into their plots and holes, forcing them to buy poor quality products with their weak and fragile income. Let's take a look at the food industry. In this one, we can talk about different cases. Let's start with the case of little Christopher's death. The latter was Teta Esvieta's son, and had congenital dislocation of the hip, which made it impossible to walk. Unfortunately, one of the possible causes of his death might have been the consumption of sausage that was unfit for export. This shows how food producers do not care about the overall health from their consumer, exhibiting the greed that drives and controls their actions. In addition, after Christopher's death, his mother remembered about the European doctor and his offer for the poor. This was thought as an act of charity and as a miracle, but in fact, they were just subjects for his surgery. It is evident how consumers have a closed mind and a weak perspective that can be easily altered by media, which can be changed, which can change their beliefs and ideas. On the other hand, the case of Teta Elzbieta's work have revealed to our studios the high demand from the consumers and the selfishness from the factory owners. One factory used brutal means to produce huge amounts of sausages in small amounts of time. Even though industrialization is evident and well used, like the adoption of new devices that shorten time and speed up work, and chemicals that will help products last and hide imperfections, these advances affect the workers as well as the consumers in a severe way. These products are no longer healthy. They are created with spoiled, moldy, white, and rotten meat, with which is unfit for other purposes. It displays the brutal and cruel results from the demand and greed from the factory owners, and how it affects the workers, society, and in general consumers. With this, poor Teta Elzbieta and her family observed the true colors of Packingtown and understood the old jest about hog's quill. It's horrible to realize how factories and greed made Packingtown a machine that exterminates and swallows all the individuals that lack the knowledge to survive. Federico Rojas, Jungle News, on to you.
That's it for this week. Tune in next time for the Jungle Report.